It's a lady here who requires no introduction. I mean, Diana's obviously very well respected, very well known within the network and beyond as well. So I'd like to thank her very much for this, what is no doubt going to be an excellent session on feedback as a springboard for learning. So over to you, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at my notes, so excuse the fact that you're going to see my hair most of the time. Anyway, in this session, as well as talking through various points, I'll also be inviting you to contribute your thoughts and answers to some of my questions in the chat box. So apart from that, though, it's going to be very low tech. And I'm going to be referring to several authors, and there's a bibliography at the end of the slides. And there are going to be different materials that I've used or other teachers have used, which will be available as Word documents for you to use and abuse afterwards. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? We're going to be looking, first of all, at what feedback is and what teachers can give feedback on and why it's important and when it can be included in a lesson, and how we should, perhaps, and shouldn't manage feedback. And then we're going to be looking at different feedback options that we can use with different levels and ages of students. Okay, so first of all, what is feedback? Here, we're going to look at a definition by Hattie and Timperley, except I've left out some words. So feedback is information provided by an agent regarding an aspect of one's performance or understanding. So who do you think the agents could be? So obviously one agent could be a teacher. Can you think of, and write down in the chat box, the 5 other agents you think that could be involved in providing feedback for our students? Okay, let me now, thank you very much for that. Let's have a look here at what they suggest. So we mentioned teachers, peers, parents. We didn't mention book or self or experience, which is obviously, we can give feedback to ourselves, can't we? Okay, so now what I'd like you to do, bearing this in mind, we're going to look at some images connected to feedback that I found on the net. When I was preparing this session, I looked I Googled feedback to see what images came up. And I'd like us to explore some associations that we may have regarding the concept of feedback. So for each image, what I'd like you to do is to note down or think of any associations that come to your mind. So here's an example to start us off. Okay, so this is what sprang to my mind when I saw this image. It's seen as negative, destructive, intimidating, and demotivating. The teacher is an authoritarian figure. Yes, Abby. Aggressive. Yes, yes. Noisy and unpleasant. The object of the feedback is obviously just to pick out the faults, and that the student is passive and has no voice or input in the feedback process. Okay, so now I'd like you to do the same if you like, okay? So here's the next image. What associations spring to mind for you when you see that regarding feedback? Okay. Right, okay, so this is Yeah, all very negative things here coming up. Okay, this is what there's no right answers. These are the things I thought. So is it, is there a routine for feedback or not? Is there a set time for it? Yes, Kathy said, is it programmed? Should it come at the end of something, at the end of a task or a lesson? And is it always reactive or can it be proactive? Is it always giving immediate feedback or can you have delayed feedback? Okay, next one. What do you think springs to mind when you see this in terms of feedback? Now, okay, so Annie's thinking it's positive, supportive, interactive, individual. Yeah, let's look at my comments here. Yeah, working on shared understandings. Yeah, constructive, Anna says. So this is an interesting point that the teacher, as well as the student, may be learning something from the student. It could be something about the student, about the learning process, or it could be about the content of what the student is learning or teaching the teacher. Here's another one. What associations do you have in terms of feedback here? Okay, so it's student-centered. Yeah, safe learning, that's interesting. It's collaborative. Okay. Yeah, what did I put? That students are learning from each other. Are they more autonomous? The teacher doesn't seem to be very evident. Have they been trained to give supportive feedback? There's not much point in having students giving each other feedback if it's not very positive and they don't know how to give feedback. And it appears here that it's not intimidating, it's motivating. Oh, and I like Sarah's point that it's helping weaker students, perhaps. And there's time for reflection and learning from the experience. Thank you. Okay. Now, moving on. So looking at effective feedback. So that quote came from Hattie and Timperley, and they suggest that feedback can be seen from three perspectives. Firstly, it answers the question, where am I going? So what are my goals and are my goals appropriate? So that's, if you like, feed up. How am I going? What progress have I made so far? So obviously retrospective feedback. And then where to next? What do I need to do to modify or maintain my performance? So feed forward. Okay, so going back to that definition that we had here, I'd like you to think now, which are the most relevant agents for primary age children and why do you think, which are the most important for a child in terms of feedback and why? So Lisa says teacher and parent. Of course, it's not to say that none of these are not important, but perhaps the most important may be seen as the adult, really, in terms of having positive effect. In terms of a constructivist Piagetian approach, the children from 7 to 11-year-olds are entering, they're in the concrete operational cognitive stage of learning and development, and they're developing the skills of reflection and justifying, and they're starting to be able to deal with abstract and hypothetical concepts, and they tend to have opinions which are not very nuanced. They're still rather black and white. So they're still obviously very reliant on older, more experienced adults for self-affirmation and direction, to provide them with feed up, i.e. to give them an idea of how they can meet challenges and goals, feedback, helping them to see what progress they've made, and attainment, or lack of attainment, and feed forward in helping them to understand what they need to do to continue to improve. Okay, so now think about the next one, teenagers, adolescents, young adults. Which do you think, which agents are most important for them and why? Yeah, it changes, doesn't it? Okay, so once they are 11, reaching 11, 12 years old, children are entering the formal operational cognitive stage of development. And during this stage, adolescents develop their ability to reason better in the abstract, to be able to think through hypothetical what-if scenarios. As Sarah was saying earlier, that young ones are much more dependent on older people. They need much more guidance, and they need more attention. So increasingly at the age 11 onwards, they're more they can be more reliant on themselves for information about their own behavior. And they're able to perceive more nuanced outcomes rather than binary opposites, in terms of always or never. They can start to, for example, they can start to see that there are shades of grey, and they start to answer to give validity to your points. They start to depend on feedback from those that they feel are more qualified to judge, and that can be socially, might often be their peers, and in terms of education, it'll usually be their teachers. Okay, so next point. So we can give feedback in two areas. We can give feedback on our students' learning, and we can give feedback on our students' attitudes and behavior or behaviors. Okay, so looking at the first point of learning, we can give feedback on content, i.e. telling them, or eliciting from them how interesting or relevant their actual ideas are. We can give feedback in terms of language form or forms, how correctly they use and choose structures, lexis or pronunciation, word order or spelling, for example. We can give feedback in terms of the student's level of understanding, in terms of how well they're understanding the meaning of language forms, or the meaning of tenses, or the meaning of different functions. We can give feedback on their skills work as well. For example, their ability to listen for specific information, their ability to read between the lines, their ability to speed read if necessary, or understand text organization, or interact in a speaking activity. And we can give feedback on the processes and strategies that they use in order to complete tasks. For example, the way they plan or don't plan a writing task, if they're planning it in sufficient depth, if they're actually reading the question properly, and in terms of speaking, if they're paraphrasing, if they know how to paraphrase when they don't know the exact word for something. And then attitudes and behavior in terms of feedback. This also links to metacognition, and metacognition can be defined as knowing about knowing. And that Ellis, there's a recent book by Ellis and Ibrahim where they describe 4 different areas of metacognition: of self-awareness, language awareness, cognitive awareness, and social awareness. And self-awareness is being able to formulate realistic expectations and set and meet personal goals. Making sure that students understand their capabilities and their awareness of their strengths and weaknesses. Language awareness is the ability to describe and analyze language, being able to make comparisons between different tenses or forms or functions, finding similarities and differences between the student's mother tongue and the target language, being able to discover rules, being able to develop positive attitudes towards the target language and language learning. Cognitive awareness refers to getting students to think about how they learn, strategies to help them remember, to help them concentrate or pay attention, and how and when to review, how to monitor their learning and decide what they need to do next. And finally, social awareness is being able to understand and able to learn from and with other people. Actually, there was another of these lows that Lizzie Pinnard gave last year called Bringing Metacognition into the Classroom, which was really, I found it really interesting. So you could perhaps go onto the IHWO website and and find the recording there if you wanted more information on that session. Okay, moving back then to the different areas of giving feedback. So knowing now that what metacognition involves, and it's more involved with attitude and behavior, it can help, we can give feedback on participation. So being able to take part in open class language or skills-based activities, being prepared to say more than the minimum in closed pair work, not being a passenger in a pair writing activity. We can give feedback in terms of the efforts students make. For example, the fact that a student might be persevering even in the face of some initial difficulties, the fact that the student is working methodically and carefully on a task, or writing or saying more than the bare minimum. We can give feedback and get feedback in terms of the student's cooperation. So helping, for example, another student when they're having difficulties, doing an activity that they don't particularly enjoy doing, because they understand that there are other people that might enjoy doing it, and showing give and take in the classroom. All of the things I'm talking about here are obviously directed mostly at young learners, although not exclusively. We can give our students feedback on their level of concentration. So when they help another student, so they ensure that they don't distract other students, or they don't allow himself or herself to get distracted. And when they listen and read carefully, if this is appropriate. And we can give feedback on their ability to self-monitor. So that involves how they are managing or not to regulate their own behavior or attitudes. So if you catch them being good, so if you can see that they're trying hard to concentrate or not get distracted by someone else in the classroom, then the teacher can obviously give some feedback to show that you've noticed that. Self-monitoring also refers to their growing sense of self-awareness as a learner both inside the classroom and at home. Okay, so why is feedback important? So feedback is a means of motivating students through meaningful plays, meaningful being the key word here, reviewing and extending understanding and production of language or skills work, correcting mistakes or behaviours, so you can have obviously corrective feedback, helping students persevere on their learning journey and in the face of challenges, and helping develop learner autonomy, and helping build a supportive classroom climate. All of these, you can see, are very much focused on the students. However, feedback is obviously vital for the teacher. It's vital for the teacher to get some feedback as well. So you can use feedback from your students that they can inform you of their current interests, their abilities, their difficulties. They can inform you of their perceived goals. It's a means of assessing their current understanding of a language point. And you can use it to develop your own awareness of cognitive abilities or thinking processes of a particular age of learners. For example, imagine that you haven't taught a particular age group before. Well, getting some feedback, whether it's formal or informal feedback, is a way of you developing your own teacher awareness. Okay, so next point, when can and should feedback be involved and included in the language teaching and learning process? I'd like you to think of and write down some different times when you can give and involve students in feedback. For example, you might say, oh, you can involve students in feedback at the end of a lesson. Can you think of other times and opportunities and write them down? That's interesting. During the break, so that would be quite informal. Might say, right. Yes. So during a task. Oh, that's interesting. End of a production task before doing it again. Yes, in terms of a task-based cycle. Yes, that's interesting, Nick. Doing an activity that was maybe experimental with this group. You want to find out what they thought of the activity. Great. Right, okay. Yes, here correction. Okay. These are some. You've mentioned some other great ones, which I will have to add. Thank you for that feedback from you. I will have to add your comments and your suggestions to this list. Just read through my list and we can see which together how many we've got, the various opportunities there are for feedback. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is for how perhaps not to manage feedback. There are two researchers, Kluger and Denisi, analysed feedback research. So it was like a meta-analysis of feedback research going from 1905 to 1995. And this is what they found. That in 38% of well-designed studies, feedback actually made performance worse, which is kind of counterintuitive, really. You'd think that feedback would be a good thing, but obviously from what we've seen, especially of that first slide, it can be detrimental. So what I'd like you to do now is look at these questions that a teacher might ask and tell me if you have any criticisms of them in terms of asking for feedback. Yes, oh no, Lisa, but why oh no? Absolutely. No student's going to say, I don't understand. Well, not necessarily, but there is a condition under which they will say it. Of course, it is better to concept check. Yes, absolutely, as you're going on. That's right. There is this reluctance to admit that you might be not understanding. Absolutely spot on the comments that you're making here. Yes. Yes, the comments that are very much reflected what I was thinking. The problem is that the students may not feel confident about their understanding or their performance and in fact need further clarification. But these types of questions, they have the effect of closing down, as you've noticed. They close down interaction because they may not know, the students may not know how to explain their difficulties. Peer pressure may make them want to conform and not be seen as stupid or being keeny-weeny or being difficult. And also they may just feel they need to please the teacher. Yes, and as Sarah says, confidence and morale can be crushed as well. Yet the third question is oddly worded too. I'd say it's not at all graded. So you do need to grade your language as well. Otherwise, the students may be prepared to give you some feedback, but they just don't understand your question. So a teacher needs to create an atmosphere where students' questions are positively encouraged and in fact expected. And this may initially mean not asking this type of very general open class questions. Here's an alternative. What do you think of it? So the teacher tells the students, tell each other first, what do you understand about the grammar or whatever that we've studied to get today? Secondly, what you're confused about. You can speak your own language to help you share your thoughts. So the students are expected to not give it automatic, immediate feedback to the teacher, but they have a chance to process what they're thinking and share what they're thinking. And then the students discussing it in pairs without the teacher. And then open class, the teacher elicits any answers. And I've deliberately put and here. And what? And then what happens? That's it. I mean, these points that you're making are great. Exactly. So it gives them time to think and to help each other. Somebody mentioned about writing a question they'd like to ask might be helpful as well. So the teacher then can elicit any answers and then clarify as necessary. And of course, in that time when the students are in pairs, although the teacher is not talking to them, the teacher can be sitting down, perhaps if it's an appropriate classroom to do that, or at least listening from afar, hearing and looking at the kind of gestures that students are making, their body language to gauge their level of comprehension or difficulty and confidence they have. And she can or he can deal with that in open class afterwards. Okay, right, here's another idea. What's the problem with this as a means of feedback? It's only practicing the alphabet. Yeah, that's true. That's right. So the other students might have different answers. Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Great expression. It's just rubber stamping it. It's what I call just going through the motions. It's just let's go through the answers so we can move on. There's no actual teaching. You need to, for me, going through the answers is as vital as the actual reading or listening that they were doing before, in terms of the learning and teaching process. Absolutely. Okay, so here's an alternative. What's the answer to number one? B, because it says here, do you agree or disagree? Agree. Good. Pedro, number two? D, because it says here, do you agree or disagree with Pedro? And David says, no, I think it's A because it says here. I would argue that this is a better approach to feedback of answers to a listening or reading text or a grammar exercise or whatever. Why? Absolutely. I usually ask why they put that answer. Absolutely. Which is a variation of because it says here. So here, justification is a key to the teacher getting some feedback from students. Absolutely, and it's clear that they've understood. That's right, because they might get the right answer, but for the wrong reasons, or it could just be just luck. Okay, and I just wanted to go back to the point that we were talking about in the previous. Can I just switch back here? Something I forgot that one of you mentioned that no student's ever going to say, I don't understand. Students will say that they don't understand if they have perhaps gone through this experience, realize that there's nothing to be frightened of, that the teacher won't tolerate other students laughing at them, that it's expected that they will have problems, and that you're encouraging a questioning atmosphere in the classroom. So you can, from this type of atmosphere, get students to say genuinely, I don't understand, or can you explain this, or what's the difference between X and Y? Sorry, I just forgot to mention that. Okay, right, here's another. Okay, what's the problem with this as feedback? Yeah, overpraising. And there's absolutely no feedback on the content. And no interest in the content. Exactly. You know, the teacher is just interested. Oh, good, they've used past simple. Oh, great. So it's not a natural. It's not a natural way of going about having a conversation either. Um, and so you just need to be aware of overpraise or meaningless praise. Yeah. So Carol Reed has a great blog called The ABC of Teaching Children, which I'm sure some of you have been onto. And she says this kind of praise can create dependency and a classroom culture of what has sometimes been called praise junkies, i.e., children who need someone else to judge and evaluate what they've done rather than developing the inner confidence to be able to do it themselves. She suggests the most helpful kind of praise is descriptive rather than judgmental. In other words, instead of just saying, that's fantastic, brilliant, the teachers are specific and describe, if possible in detail, succinct detail, what they wish to praise. For example, I see a neat and careful paragraph, or I noticed that you only used English in the game. Although through describing what you can see or feel or notice, she says, you can give children an external model of what they can do or have achieved. And this allows them to internalize what you say and recognize their own strengths. For example, they will then think, I am becoming a neat and careful writer, and I'm able to play a game using only English. So there the teacher is externalizing what hopefully can later be internalized by the student. So in this way, feedback is used to feed forward and feed up to future goals and positive routes to take on a learning journey. Okay, here's the next thing. What do you think of this? What criticisms do you have about this kind of feedback from the teacher? Yeah, and the reason why what is there for the students to say? Exactly, or maybe they only say yes. exactly. So, it's not really, there's some content, but it's not very specific content. And how does she know that they've had a good time? Okay, yes, nothing wrong with teacher talking time if it's effective and it's for a purpose. And again, you're inclined, it's yes, exactly. You're inclining students to agree. You want students to agree with you. Okay, so next point here. Now dealing with behaviour. What do you think of this way of giving feedback on these two students' behaviour here? Yeah, the student's obviously not concentrating. And of course, we all do use this language, but it's got to be precise and specific. And the danger is it's just going to go over the student's head if it's continual. So here's my suggestion for an alternative. Yes, exactly. And the students may feel you're picking on them. Yes, it becomes meaningless. So here the teacher is just making an observation. And the reason for saying that is to make the students think about not just be quiet, what not to do, but actually what is happening, what is going on, and perhaps why the teacher is not happy. So it's much more descriptive, and it's also um, uh, uh, the language is not blaming, but it's just an observation. Of course, when they've got no more than the word red, yes, exactly. I mean, you can't go in for these long description here. Yes, but even so, I think you can use gesture to keep, to be quiet and indicate that somebody else is talking at the same time. Okay. Now, what I'd like to look at now is looking at some options for some case studies, some options for feedback. So this is what you're going to see here is a vocabulary exercise which I did with a group of B1 students. But of course, you could use many other types of vocabulary exercise topics or exercises. And the actual table that I used was much longer than this. So I got my students to complete this table as a jigsaw pair work activity. So this might be this one is student A. Student B would obviously have the other words completed. I then asked my students to reflect. So they did the exercise, and here you've got the completed one. I then asked my students to reflect in closed pairs on the vocabulary using these questions which I wrote on the board. So in the first one, and just to go through the answers, which words were new? I was interested in finding out what was new for them and what they already knew. In the words which are different from Portuguese in-laws, they don't have a similar way of saying that. Pronunciation in Portuguese will be aunt, a difficulty, and then words with slightly different meaning is parent. And the last question, in fact, it includes son. The table includes son, daughter, and children. Of course, children has got two meanings in English in terms of the children of parents and children as previous and new knowledge. as opposed to what I predict it might be in the future. I thought that I was pleasantly surprised. I thought that they would have more difficulty with this exercise in terms of base knowledge of vocabulary than they did. It was also to give them some feedback back by helping to raise their own self-awareness of the differences in terms of how ideas are expressed in English and Portuguese, to make them more language aware, and yeah, so that's one activity I have done. Okay, so this is another activity with a lower level of students, so A2 plus level, teenagers. And these are what I did at the beginning of the academic year. I got them to write about them and their family, their interests, and they gave me their paragraphs, and I marked them, and I took some of the sentences and I collated them and made them into a worksheet. So here's the first part of the worksheet. It's to provide and get some feedback from the students on their language awareness. So as you can see here, the students have got some sentences, and they've got to try and find the 2 correct sentences. Again, in the actual exercise, there were 10 sentences. And then having done that, having found them, they tried to correct the other sentences. And as they were doing that, and after they were doing that, they had to think what the mistake in each sentence is, why it's wrong, and what the correction is, and what they're working in pairs, what they need to remember to avoid making that mistake in the future, and what does that individually, what do you personally need to remember? So my objectives in terms of this exercise were to get some feedback from them in terms of their level of understanding of grammatical forms, so it's kind of diagnostic, trying to find out their ability to identify problems and their ability to understand what's required to correct mistakes, and to understand why some sentences are also correct. I also wanted to give some feedback in terms of peer teaching, with one student helping another, giving some feedback to each other. And I wanted to give some feedback, I wanted to give feedback to them, helping to them to raise their own self-awareness of their personal, individual difficulties, and hopefully develop self-regulation, which we talked about earlier. And I wanted to show the students that their opinions are valid and useful to the teacher. Because I want to encourage this idea of getting them to think about learning and giving me feedback. Okay, so now Gail Ellis and Naya Ibrahim, in their book Teaching Children How to Learn, suggest including a review stage to help young learners reflect on their learning. And I've been using this, similar to the one previous, recently with my teenage groups. I wrote these questions on the board. Okay, and then I also wrote, okay, so I asked them to write their answers. The focus of the lesson had been 0 first and second conditionals. But you could use this same template of questions with any language or skills content. And I thought it might be interesting for you to see the kind of feedback that they gave me as their teacher. So here I've selected some quite telling examples. So here, what did you learn? So here I'm getting feedback in terms of what do they understand as in terms of the purpose of the lesson, and to see how and to develop their self-awareness. It gives me an idea of who's, and what I learned from this is I got a better idea of who's seen and not seen the 0 first and second conditional before. And then, what did you learn? This is a great one. Well, you can't please all the people, can you really? But except I thought that was quite interesting feedback for me, because in fact the boy that said that in fact had learnt quite a lot. What he meant was, I've seen this, I've studied this at school before, but as we all know, studying something and supposedly knowing it doesn't mean to say you can actually use it better. So what I learned from that is I need to make it more clear to him what he's got out of what I feel he might get out of the lesson, in terms of learning something new or adding to his knowledge. The second question was, how did you learn? And this question showed me their level of cognitive and social awareness about how they learn. I like that, intelligent exercises. And this, Diana explained it and then Claudia said it in a different way so I could understand it a bit better. That's great. So obviously the teacher is not great at explaining here, but I think that's a very valid point, that, you know, the student needs it explained various times, and or not explained, but needs to be exposed to it and work with it in various times and perhaps through various different means and voices. Did you enjoy the activities? Here, the answers are obviously quite gratifying for me, but the reasons for the enjoyment, the reasons themselves were quite interesting. We could try and explain their doubt by ourselves. We could try and work things out by ourselves. So here the teacher's working out, the students are thinking about the actual grammar. And here the students obviously saying that the lesson was useful because they're now feeling a bit more confident about things. Comfortable, I think, is a nice way of putting it. What do you need to improve? Here's an opportunity to feed forward. Robert Fisher says that looking back helps us look forward. Targets are more likely to be met if they're agreed by us and are personal to us. Some of these comments are more specific than others, and indicate the need for me to input or elicit some learner training study skills techniques to students. Again, study more doesn't actually, in practice, doesn't actually mean much really. That I need to work with them on how they can practice, how they can study more effectively. And then my last question, why did I ask you these questions? This was designed to show students that they could provide feedback to me. Or not. So here it was interesting to me to see what their level of understanding in terms of my involvement in their thinking processes. Okay, so this activity itself, getting the students to work in pairs or individually, writing their answers down, giving it to me, the whole thing took about 15 minutes of a lesson, which of course is quite a long time in terms of lessons. It was the first time we'd done it. You may need, but on the other hand, you don't have to get students to write. You could get students to discuss their answers just in pairs or in groups of 3, with one person reporting back and the teacher responding and taking notes as necessary. Like anything, the more frequently you do this, the more it becomes a classroom routine and the more efficient you are in managing it. And also, like anything, you perhaps wouldn't want to do this with every activity or in every lesson in order for it to retain its freshness. Okay, so now training our students to give each other feedback. We're going to look at a couple of ways of managing peer feedback. And what follows is a checklist that you can use with students preparing for a speaking exam. This one is from Pet for Schools, and the students work in groups of 3, so 2 candidates and an examiner. So this was my procedure. I handed out the checklist to each group, 1 checklist per group of 3, and I got all the students to read through it and make sure that they understood, firstly, the English in the checklist, the purpose of the activity, and how to complete the checklist. And then I personally gave the instructions for this part of the exam. It was part 2, the collaborative part of the exam. And meanwhile, and then each pair of candidates talked while the examiner, the other student in the group, listened and made notes or circled the checklist as appropriate. Okay, so one checklist did for both candidates. And they weren't allowed, obviously, to interrupt. And then after they'd finished their speaking, the couple of minutes, I handed out the checklists to the candidates as well for them to self-assess. And whilst they were thinking of that, the examiners prepared their feedback. And the preparation took the form of helping them to understand the need to be supportive, sensitive, and specific. So using the 3 S's. And then I directed the examiners to give their feedback and say that at this point the candidates could join in too. Okay, so then another way of getting learners to give each other feedback. Of course, you can get students to give and get feedback from each other by assessing each other's writing. I used a set of descriptors to assess each student's written work, and then got each student to assess the other's work. They then compared their assessment to mine. And finally, when they had done that, in terms of feedback, I asked them to give me some feedback answering this question. What's your opinion about the work we've done on learning and assessing writing and assessing each other's writing? I was interested to see what their results were. Just have a look through. This is obviously not all of the responses, but some of the responses, and they were written in Portuguese and I translated them into English. Okay, so my question for you now is, in what way was this feedback informative, and who was it informative for? So how was this feedback informative to the teacher and to the students? Yeah, that's right, yes, in terms of developing their awareness. Absolutely, Anna. Yeah. Okay. So it's a way of developing their metacognition, improving their motivation and perseverance of learning. And for me, what I learned from it was I wasn't aware of the degree of self-reflection that 12, 13-year-olds are capable of in terms of their language and English, and the understanding that they showed regarding the assessment procedure, and also the empathy they have for the teacher's role in terms of marking as well. Okay, it seems to these comments seem to support a claim by McNamara and Morton that when peer feedback is combined with teacher feedback, then behaviour is changed. Okay, what about very young learners? How can we train them to reflect and give feedback? Here's an idea that I got from a presentation given by Sandy Morel at a recent conference on assessment. Okay, so she has these cards and deliberately differently coloured. The first set is to do with students' personal, giving feedback or assessing their personal feelings towards an activity. The assessment in terms of behaviour. the activities that they've done in the lesson, how they've done them, whether it's been at table, whether it's a whole class, pairs or individually, and the skills that are involved. So these images can be used in various ways. Firstly, you can get the students to answer yes or no when she points to a picture and asks, for example, did we do any reading today? So it's just getting them to think about what's been going on in the lesson, really. You could use them to get the children to make their own set of pictures, and each child holds up the appropriate card in answer to the teacher's question. Or you could include the images on worksheets and the teacher that you may make, and the teacher have to circle the appropriate pictures. So feedback obviously involves reflection, and we need to plan it carefully so that it's seen by our young students as special time when what they say really matters. Okay, so feedback on behaviour or misbehaviour. The teacher could treat a naughty student, an offending student, to a lecture at the end of a lesson, for example, using a top-down transmission approach as a means of corrective feedback. However, we have to remember that feedback given isn't necessarily feedback received, assimilated and applied. So here's an alternative which I often use with students. Questions? So here I'm really wanting, rather than just me doing all the talking, I'm wanting the student to actually think and consider their behaviour. Dylan Williams says that feedback given should be more work for the recipient than the donor. In this way, I would suggest this questioning technique. The student is playing an active part in getting feedback by having to give feedback to the teacher. Okay, so somebody mentioned earlier about feedback after exams, and here's an idea. So a post-mock exam tutorial can potentially offer a teacher or a teenager or an adult students a valuable opportunity for feed up. So helping them to define their individual goals and feedback, as obviously assessing their progress so far, and feed forward what needs to be modified or maintained from now on. In Torres, Vedras, in our school, our teachers have worked very hard compiling tutorial sheets for students where pertinent comments for each paper are selected from a bank of comments, and they're cut and paste onto a tutorial, like this example here. So there's a bank of comments with various different sentences that the teacher can select for each paper as relevant for the student, the individual student, and then a summative comment here. But as you can imagine, compiling these tutorial sheets is quite time consuming, and there was also, in terms of feedback as a mechanism, there was little opportunity for some students to process and assimilate all this written information because much of the feedback was top down from the teacher and non-interactive. So this is now how we're updating the sheet and the whole process. So we have a master of a tutorial sheet with comments for each part of each paper. So this is just what you can see here is just paper one. So there are set comments for each part of each paper. And the student is given this double-sided sheet of tutorial sheet, and at this point they don't know what they can see their mock exam, but they don't know their scores for each paper or the total score. And they look through their mock exam and they highlight or select the comments for each part of each paper and then make any other relevant comments in the right-hand column in terms of what they need to do for the future. The teacher also has a copy in which, for each individual, in which she also highlights relevant comments. They don't need to write other comments on the right-hand column. In the tutorial, which is designed to be only 5 minutes, done during class time, so whilst the others are going through their mock paper and compiling their tutorial sheet, the teacher is taking out one student at a time and giving the tutorial. The teacher and the student compare their respective tutorial sheets and they discuss together the way forward, and the student should be making a note of any extra ideas coming as a result of discussion or coming from the teacher. So feedback here should be clear, specific, precise and constructive. So for me, the advantage for teenagers or young adults doing this type of thing is that they are required to take more responsibility, to reflect and offer themselves and the teacher feedback on their performance and what they need to do next, rather than simply look at their scores and rank them with the other people in their class, which actually doesn't help them improve. It might make them feel good, bad, but it doesn't actually necessarily show them how and what they need to do to improve. Okay. So that just about brings us to the end. Here is the bibliography of the references that I've used in this session. And you may find it interesting to reflect on this session and give yourself and me some feedback. So to that end, I've made a survey monkey, which you may like to answer these questions. And the survey monkey is there, and that all remains for me to do is to say thank you very much, and I hope that some of these ideas have given you food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. I believe we've got some handouts to just download here. Yes. If you click on to the file itself, then you'll be able to download it directly from the link that's here. I'll also quickly type in the SurveyMonkey link into the box so that you can click on it directly there. So thank you very much for a great session. I'm glad I could actually get my speakers to work and hear it as well. I think there are a lot of transferable things there that work for all ages and levels. So I'm sure everyone will join me in giving you a huge round of applause. Yeah.